Today, as you can see, I'm joined by both Dr. Shannon Philip and Leslee Udwin, and I will introduce them both properly for you in just a moment. So thank you for joining. This is a webinar brought to you by School of International Futures, who I have a Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Fellowship with. So thank you to Fash, who's behind the scenes supporting us with making this happen. This webinar is going to take the form of what I would call a fast-paced Futures Literacy Laboratory. So over at UNESCO, I'm working with the Futures Literacy team there, and we run these labs essentially. So this webinar is inspired in many ways by what we call a Futures Literacy Lab. And to give you a sense of what a Futures Literacy Lab is, or just Futures Literacy in more detail, Futures Literacy is a capability. So everybody learns in school these days to both read and write, but how literate are they in using their imagination? And the objective of Futures Literacy is to cultivate that capability. It asks us to think about how we use the future and to use it in more creative ways, and to understand the role that it has in what we see and do in the present. It encourages us to think about the assumptions that we hold, and by virtue of doing different exercises, become more futures informed in the action that we can take in the present. That's the essential idea. So today, we're going to it's going to be a Futures Literacy experience for everybody involved in many ways. For those of you that have some familiarity with futures, and for those of you who don't, we hope that you enjoy this kind of creative exercise. We're hoping that this is going to be a space for both creative imagination from our panelists and from you, but also an opportunity to challenge our assumptions and to cultivate a sense of hope that we can actually transform the future in the direction in which we want to transform it. To give you a sense of structure, today we're going to be looking at all phases of what would constitute a Futures Literacy Lab if we were to do it in full. We're going to be looking at the probable future, that being the future that's most likely, the preferable future, that being the future that we think is desirable, what we call a reframe, where I will take a few of the images that our panelists share and tease out a few assumptions that come from that and flip them back, we'll give some new parameters to almost confuse us and to think about different types of scenarios I could imagine. And then we'll think about new questions and next steps that we can take in light of the exercises that we've gone through today. Just some general caveats. Of course, this is a webinar with two panelists. It's obviously not going to be representative of all the voices that one can imagine for a conversation like this. And there are, of course, barriers to having a virtual conversation. So we obviously acknowledge that, but we're going to do our best to try to cover a lot. But in many ways, this should just be a taster of the kind of conversation that one can have around these things. And yes, of course, we encourage your engagement throughout, through the chat, but especially when we get to the new questions and the next steps towards the end, we really encourage you to give your thoughts on that. But do feel free throughout to give your thoughts on different types of futures as well. Okay, to introduce both our guests then. Let me just make sure I'm all set. Yeah, okay. To introduce both our guests. First, Dr. Shannon Philip. Shannon is a sociologist based at the University of Cambridge. He is currently researching gender, masculinities, and urban transformations in post-apartheid South Africa and contemporary India. He is interested in the intersections of race, gender, sexualities, masculinities, class, and development in the urban context of New Delhi and Johannesburg. Shannon is the author of Becoming Young Men in a New India, Masculinities, Gender Relations and Violence in the Post-Colony. This is a book that is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press next month, June 2022. So Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. And I believe you're joining us from Johannesburg today. And our second guest is Leslee Udwin. Leslee is a world-renowned filmmaker and educator. She's the producer of the award-winning documentary India's Daughter, which told the story of the gang rape and murder of 23-year-old medical student Jyoti Singh in 2012. It's commonly known as the Nirbhaya case. After making this film, Leslee founded Think Equal, a global non-profit charity that co-designs early years education programs to build socio-emotional skills among 3 to 6 year olds. It is currently impacting more than 200,000 children in more than 20 countries across 6 continents. So this is who we are joined by today, two quite remarkable people. Thank you both for joining us for this conversation on futures and masculinity, and I'm really excited now to dive into that with you and everybody who's joining us as well.
Kushal, can I make a little intervention now, which is completely unbidden? unintended that I would do so, but will you allow me a moment to reflect on something quite extraordinary?
Okay.
You've just mentioned Johannesburg, the city in which I was raped by a man at the age of 18. You've just mentioned New Delhi, the city in which the gang rape and murder of Jyoti Singh, Nirbhaya, led me to interview rapists and find out what makes human beings like them do the things they do to other human beings. And I'm sitting here in a school in Tower Hamlets in London, which is one of the many thousands of schools now around the world that are implementing the program Think Equal, which in my world is the only way we're going to have any kind of future, let alone the future we perfectly imagine. And I cannot help but express that immediately because I am virtually in shock. And this is, all these things have just risen to the surface in me, and I just wanted to share them immediately. I hope that's okay. What a weird coincidence.
Of course, that's okay, Leslie. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we do hope that that this is a conversation that everyone enjoys being part of. And just to mention for everybody joining, I should probably flag this at the beginning, but there are going to be moments in this conversation that could be quite difficult. There are likely to be some references to violence and so on. So we do encourage you to just bear that in mind. And if there are any triggers and so on, then please take the necessary precautions. So to get us going then, and Leslie's already touched on this quite nicely for us, I would just like to ask each of our panelists, and perhaps Leslie, we'll start with you because you've already given us a sense of this, just why this topic? Before we dive into the futures activities, I'm keen to just get a sense from each of you, why this topic is important, how you understand it at the moment, and its current nature in the world today. What is the state of masculinity today? Just to get a general sense of where you're coming at this from. Leslie, over to you first, please, for your brief thoughts on that.
For me, this is probably the single most important topic. Now, I know that climate activists would say, what the hell are you talking about? If we don't get the climate right, we won't even have a planet to exist in, let alone how we exist within that planet. But quite frankly, if we don't get the mindset right, we don't have a hope of anything. Neither a planet nor its climate. We have nothing because we are headed towards the most disastrous scenario imaginable. And it's getting worse and worse by the day. And why does that tie in with masculinity? Not because men are innately bad, not because men innately enjoy to wield their power to oppress, to rape, to maim, to kill, to murder, but because men are doing this wholesale, because they're programmed to do that, because they are programmed with a kind of toxic masculinity that is wrecking our world, has been and continues to. And until we stop this dead in its tracks and change that mindset, and it is all to do with masculinity, because it is all to do with patriarchal mindset and patriarchal culture, which is what rules the bloody world. Let's face it. Let's get real about it. It's not the women who are going around prosecuting wars in Yemen and in Syria and in Ukraine. It's not the women who are doing this. It's the men. Now, it's not because men, as I say, are innately bad. It's because men are innately badly programmed. So are women. We're all programmed to support that system in which patriotism, a patriarchal mindset and patriarchy are the rulers of the day. But that is what is happening, The shootings in the school yesterday in America, what's that to do with? It's to do with the gun industry. Who runs that? It's men who run that. Let's name it and let's decide to do something about it. But let's not decide to do something about it where we can't make a difference by being reactive to it. Let us decide to start preventing, not just reacting, because until and unless we prevent, And preventing means a very specific thing. Preventing means going in before the age of 6. And until and unless we do that, hopeless, the whole thing is hopeless. That's my view.
Leslie, thank you so much for sharing that. And let's hope by the end of the day that we don't feel as hopeless. Let's hope.
But wait a minute, Kushal. I'm full of hope. I'm the most hopeful person, I guarantee you, on this panel and amongst the audience. I guarantee you, because I have devised a program together with world experts, which is changing mindset and doing so in 20 countries around the world. I am the most hopeful person you can find on planet Earth, because I'm doing something about it and seeing the fruits of that labor actually working easily, very inexpensively, replicably, and scalably. So I'm full of optimism and hope. I'm sitting in the school where I've just been regaled by the teachers of stories of violent little boys who have turned around in 4 months, miraculously. Rocket science, no. Neuroscience, yes.
Thank you, Leslie. Shannon, over to you. I'm wondering if you're also brimming with hope on this topic. Just a general sense of your understanding of masculinity and how it relates in terms of the academic work that you're doing, and why this is an important conversation to have, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. Perhaps Leslie is right. She might be the most hopeful person on the panel. I am somewhat hopeful, but also quite concerned about masculinity, its future, and the various impacts it has for all of us. My engagement with masculinity is growing up as a queer child in India, in a school, in an all-boys school, thinking about the kinds of expectations that are on me in the way I'm to be, the way I'm to walk, the way I'm to talk, the way my hands are to move. And from that onwards, the burden that is also placed on men, as well as the expectations and the power that they enjoy and inhabit. So for me, masculinity is about both, actually. The power, the patriarchal power that Leslie is touching on, that men enjoy in a very unequal way, but also the great vulnerability, the great anxiety, the great narrowness of script that is available to boys and young men to express themselves, to express their thoughts, their feelings in many ways. And so it's both the possibilities of this power and the dangers of this power, but along with it, the great vulnerabilities, anxieties that these men hold. And actually both can speak to each other in hopeful ways, but also quite problematic ways. A lot of this hopelessness, this trapped, bottled up feeling can manifest itself in very complex, dangerous, unhelpful, unhealthy ways for men, for their families, for the women in their lives, but also for the world at large, right? At the same time, the ability of men to care, to show love, to show concern is also extremely real, right? And that's where I think I want to pick up this point about patriarchy that Leslie is touching on. And that's why I think patriarchy is so important to address, because men are not, or masculinities are not in isolation. They are in relationships with women. Right? So most women I interview or talk to in South Africa and in India, they love the men that they are in relationships with very often. They also really dislike some of the things that these men do. So for me, actually, intellectually, but also practically, patriarchy and men in patriarchy are also loving men, but who are also violent men. And so it's that constant tension that we have to grapple with. And that's where some aspects are hopeful, some aspects are really quite troubling. And again, to just echo what Leslie's suggesting, men are not innately bad, but they live in context and they are brought up in context which produce these effects. And for me, it's always in relation. That same person brought up in a different context, in a different social setting, could have very different kinds of values and ways of doing things. And so there is reason to be hopeful because change is possible. If you're saying that men are not pathologically bad, it's these structures, this social context that we need to be talking about, that we need to be thinking about. So I'll leave it there. So hopeful, but yes, cautiously hopeful.
Thank you, Shannon, for your thoughts. So there's loads of ways that this conversation can go, and I'm excited that we've just set the ground running with a lot of insights there on hope, on power, on vulnerability, on education. There's a lot there for us to think about. So now we're going to get really into the futures aspects of today's discussion. And we're going to do that by transitioning to futures of masculinity in 2052. So 30 years from now. And we're going to begin our discussion around what we think the likely future of masculinity is in that time. So both, however we understand masculinity at the moment, how do we think that maps on to 2052? Is it the same understanding we have? Does it take on a different form? And I would like to give both panelists just 30 seconds or so just to have a little think about this, because the kinds of things that we'd be interested in here for the next 15-20 minutes or so in unpacking would be questions about not only what does masculinity perhaps look like in the future, but what impact it's having. So how does it relate to other intersections in identity? One thinks of caste, one thinks of class, sexuality, race, religion, different abilities, and so on. But also systems in the society as a whole. Are there systems changing as a result of masculinity changing? Are there things in the past, perhaps, which are shaping this trajectory that we're imagining? Just a few things like this for us to think about as we dive into the discussion. And of course, those of you who are joining us, do feel free to write your thoughts in the chat as well. So yeah, over to either Shannon or Leslie for when you're ready to just give us some initial thoughts of what you think is likely for the future of masculinity, whenever you're ready.
Well, I'll dive in. Look, for a moment, I'm going to divorce myself from what I know is happening, and I'm going to dwell on what I believe the future for masculinities and the world is, because let's not forget, as I said, it's the masculine that rules our world. So the future of our world depends on the degree to which the male masculine vision and gaze can change. I don't believe that grown men who have been programmed since the moment they've opened their eyes in this world to see that different regulations apply to them as to females or to other genders, that to believe, programmed like robots to believe that they have certain entitlements, that there are certain ways they are and things are like that. And, if a girl behaves like that, well, she has it coming. And, these are entrenched attitudes. We can't be naive and think that these are just going to fade away or dissipate. They're not. And after the age of 6, unfortunately, it takes an enormous amount of effort, therapy, will to change. And the reason I don't make films anymore is that, films can create awareness, but that ain't going to change anything. And so having said that, if we leave things as they are, if we don't come in and create a new generation, a new masculinity that isn't what it is thus far, which is toxic, right? We're just going to go further and further. The more violence we have, the more inured we get to it, or the more inured we are to it. The, boys with toys, I mean, all of the kind of inequities and the gaps between and the intersectionalities of, caste, class, religion, they are all have a sort of overweening male domination element to them. They just do, right? If we leave things as they are, well, we're getting closer and closer to self-destruction. There is no question. And it's because that toxic masculinity has led us to this and will continue to lead us to a complete annihilation of ourselves and the planet. There is no doubt we came as close to Putin pressing his hand on that button. We've come as close to that in recent weeks as is imaginable, right? So there's no way that it's not going to lead to that. Now let me come back to what I know is going to happen. Because in the 20 countries that the Think Equal program, which is a very tangible set of resources, of tools, of exercises, of narrative picture books, of best practice from psychologists and neuroscientists and educationalists and human rights activists from around the world who came together to help me make this very tangible, practical program for 3 to 6-year-old children. Already, we have one country, North Macedonia, which has a massive history of masculine-dominated war and destruction and rape, right, in the Balkan conflict, and genocide, in fact, as bad as it gets, right? That whole country has seen such, or the education ministry and labor ministry of that country saw such changes and heard about such changes of individual children who were undergoing the Think Equal program, that they have now mandated Think Equal in the national curriculum. The World Bank is funding, and UNICEF are our implementation partners on the ground. Every 5-year-old in North Macedonia, male and female, compulsory now has to learn numeracy, literacy, and Think Equal. So I know for a fact that at least one country in the world, within less than your 30 years, less than 2052, because those 5-year-olds in 10 years are 15 and are not going to be bullying, raping, hitting anyone, carrying guns or knives around. These are going to be responsible, beautiful human beings who have empathy and compassion and gender equality and racial equality and environmental stewardship and all the things that we are teaching practically, concretely, to program them to be the new masculine, the new human. It's not any longer about gender. We have to abandon that. We have to drop that because it is an artificial divide, just as caste is. For how much longer are the Sahibs going to persist in not letting the Dalits walk in their shadow or use their utensils at home? Come on, grow up, for God's sake, you know? Drop it. We are more alike as human beings than we are unlike. All of these artificial constructs to divide and rule, you know, and few have been better at that than the British. We all know that, right? So it's not, and this isn't aimed at a particular nation or group of people. This is every single country in the world is under the oppressive regime of patriarchy and that worst kind of toxic masculinity. And we have to deconstruct all that because it's not only about oppressing other genders, it's also about the wrong values. The values that say the purpose of life is the accumulation of wealth. Excuse me, who the hell are you to tell me what the purpose of my life is? I, who give life together with you, right? Don't tell me what the purpose of life is, because I don't want to sacrifice my children and my life to your worshipping of mammon or power or greed. But that's not your fault. It's what you've been programmed into. So we have started, and Shannon will be happy to hear, we're not yet in Johannesburg, but we are in Diepsloot. Diepsloot is a migrant shanty town. What would you call it, Shannon? It's a semi-slum. It's a...
Yes, a township or a semi-slum, yeah. Mm.
So in Diepsloot, in every single ECD center, it's a township of 1 million migrant workers. And every ECD center in Diepsloot is learning Think Equal. Every child in every ECD center. That's what's going to change toxic masculinity. That's what's going to change our world. In the Eastern Cape, we've signed an agreement with the Ministry of Education. The 4,100 grade R classrooms, which are reception classes, 5-year-olds, 168,000 children, probably roughly half of which are boys, are learning Think Equal, every single one of them. Those kids are not going to go out on a Friday night and do what boys who have not learned Think Equal do in the Eastern Cape as a rite of passage to becoming a man. What do on a Friday night? They go and find a girl to gang rape, because until you've done that, your culture tells you, in the Eastern Cape at least, you don't become a man. That's going to change for sure when every single 5-year-old grows to be 13, 14, 15, and is never going to do that in a million years. And that's how we're going to change things.
Thank you, Leslie, for sharing. Shannon, I'm curious to hear your thoughts there on the probable futures of masculinity. I mean, we heard Leslie reference both this idea that this power, this gaze, this tendency to violence isn't going anywhere. And perhaps it would only go somewhere if there was this kind of radical educational transformation from the early years, right? So, and Leslie also talked a little bit in reference to some systems which are perpetuating this beyond just kind of a gender binary inbuilt with discrimination, which you also kind of referenced this idea of like people valuing wealth. So this idea of capitalism there is very much part of all of this as well. So I'm wondering your thoughts on probable futures, and if in any ways it resonates with what Leslie was talking about, but how also you're understanding this question.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think Leslie's pointed out very importantly the need to have these ground level early education strategies for how children are socialized, boys in particular. But I have another aspect to also add to that. I mean, there's one thing about individual actors and training these young boys and girls and to think equally, and that's exactly what we need. It's central. But there's also something about the structures and systems of society which are reproducing gender. You know, race scholars in the US talk about racism without the racists, right? And that's essentially about how various structures reproduce racism, even if there are not individual people who are racist, right? And if we might think similarly about gender inequality or sexism and misogyny without the misogynist or without the sexist, you know, gender inequality without actually men performing that inequality or men going out to be violent towards women, but the production of violence in the structures of society, right? And that's when I'm thinking about capitalism, and particularly from an intellectual point of view for us, the study of men and masculinity is really rooted for us within wider structures of society and how they're operating. So colonialism, the need for colonialism to go out and exploit people and construct, you know, inferior and superior categories of people, and the need to have women within patriarchy in a capitalist system to be people who are at home feeding the men who are going out to work. You know, the construction of gender in these unequal ways to feed capitalism, to fuel capitalism. So when I think about the future, it's not just the future of men or women, it's also the future of our society and how society and its systems are changing. What is going to be global capital relationships in the future? How are the US, the UK, Germany in relation to India, South Africa, Macedonia, in their structures of, you know, how they trade, how they do business? Will these exploitations continue? If those exploitations continue, then women's lives keep getting exploited or gender keeps getting exploited, right? And so when we're thinking about 2052, there is some question about placing masculinities, femininities, gender in this wider structure to think about how it's operating. And the way I'm thinking about it is both at a micro level and an everyday level and at a macro level. And Leslie's already talked about the macro level a little bit. Global politics is shaped by masculinities, by masculine domination, the ways of showing power, demonstrating power, right? Why is that happening? Because there are various inequalities in global relationships that are at play, and to somehow be dominant in global power, you need to show masculine power. It's arranged in these unequal terms. Likewise, at the micro level, I mean, more and more young people I meet in South Africa and in India, so the born frees or children of liberalization, these are people born in the 1990s onwards. That's who I'm studying, talking to. Their stories are what I'm collecting. If you talk to them, they are all about gender equality. We need women's rights. We need, we don't want racism. We want to have an equal future. But their everyday practices, their lives are not conducive of those, right? So they're paying lip service to these ideas of equality, but it's not actually translating to anything much deeper at a fundamental level. That's because there's still a great lack of jobs, a great amount of pressure on them from their families, a great amount of pressure from their peer groups to perform gender in a certain way, a great amount of homophobia that still exists, effeminatophobia. Still to be a man has a very narrow script in these interpersonal relationships of people. So in that sense, for me, the future is a very complex future. And unfortunately, 30 years is not a long enough time for me to be optimistic. And so my thought is that actually it is a much more complicated and sadly worsening picture before it can improve, is how I'm seeing it, both at the micro interpersonal level, but also at the macro global level. In the project that we are doing now, these men are educated, they've been to schools, some of them are from townships within Johannesburg or from slums in Delhi, but also in middle-class neighborhoods. They are not explicitly going out there saying that we are raping women. If you talk to them, they're very clear that rape is bad, it's wrong, it's not appropriate. But they're very happy to be controlling their girlfriends, to be policing what their girlfriends wear on the street and where they're going out, who they're meeting. Coercive control, new forms of violences are also emerging because the deeper roots of inequality are not going away, right? That deeper inequality remains of how men and women are configured in relations, in opposition to each other. Women as inferior, men as superior, men as sexually active, women as passive. So in that sense, I take a slightly different view from Leslie, but I do come back to this idea that we need to move beyond gender. I like the term a genderless world. I would think about a genderless future, a future post-gender, where we are actually just bodies rather than man versus woman. We are not straight versus gay. We are people who have different kinds of sexualities, sexual relationships. We are not people who are tied to marriage and heterosexist monogamous families in narrow 2 children living in a house kind of system, but have much more complex relationships, lives with each other. And final point, as we're looking at the future, I'd also perhaps suggest that looking at the past is quite helpful. The pre-colonial past in Southern Africa, in South Asia, it is colonialism that has brought monogamy, marriage, heterosexuality, homophobia to both India and South Africa. Pre-colonial South Africa, pre-colonial India has had much more nuanced ideas of gender, of body, of identity, of personhood. In one of the books on our reading list at Cambridge is this very powerful decolonial text called The Invention of Woman, right? In the Nigerian context that Oewume Oewunki argues about. And I think the pre-colonial past of these countries give us hope that the future can also be genderless or gender-free or beyond gender, I think. But we are not going to reach there, I think, in 30 years. But with a longer time span, I do hope that we will get there one day. I'll leave it at that.
Shannon, thank you so much for all those insights. And I would also definitely recommend that book. It's a very good book. I would like, Shannon, if you wouldn't mind just elaborating a little bit more now as we transition from what we think is likely to what we think is desirable. So the preferable futures aspect of our conversation today. And you've already touched on it, the sense of a world without gender, a world of fluidity. And I would like you to just give me a little more detail as to what that world would look like, whether it be 2052 or somewhere beyond that. Let's not worry about that date precisely, but just a bit more of a sense of what kind of systems might we be seeing, if at all, and just maybe perhaps to make this a bit more imaginable for people. Can you perhaps give me a headline, say, in a world which would capture this? Say, whether there be a newspaper or whether there be other ways of communication in a desirable future that you're imagining. I would like to know a sense of what captures that world. Is there like a particular metaphor, or is there like a big headline you can imagine somewhere which gives us a sense of this is what it means, this is what it feels like? I'd just be curious for your thoughts a little bit more, some detail behind what you think is desirable.
Yes, I mean, this is the challenge, but perhaps exciting thought about what might the future be. And again, to orient myself, I'm very much a decolonial queer feminist. That's how I see myself, thinking beyond colonialism, thinking beyond feminism, to think about how all of these come together. And for me, it is a world in which we don't have these categories that are so reductive. The categories man, woman become redundant. The category straight, gay become redundant. The categories married or not married or divorced become redundant. And there is a much more open understanding. I'm speaking simply around how gender and sexual politics are to be organized, around how people are brought about. So, for example, I would think a situation where a child is born in a hospital or a child is born in a certain space, there is no pressure in the preferable future for me for that child to be labeled as this or that child's hair is not cut in this way or that way, that clothes are not bought in blue or pink already in predefined ways. There aren't even aspirations that the parent has for what this child is to do, how to do it, where to do it. That would be a world of possibilities for this child to sort of grow up into and be perhaps exploratory and not fixed by ideas. I'm greatly actually excited by my students, students who are very much identifying as non-binary or queer or somehow open-ended and open to thinking about various possibilities. There's a lot more further to go, right? Even in that. These are individual people who are trying to make some choices, but they still live in large contexts which try to gender them, which enforce a gendered identity onto them. So moving beyond that child and how they are configured, the world around us also in how it sees people, how it assimilates people, how it frames relationships, perhaps need to be rethought about, readdressed. Right? So it's quite a difficult task to somehow visualize or even imagine. It's almost an unimaginable task right now. But what makes it perhaps a little bit more plausible is to think about the idea of equality that Leslie is touching upon, I think. And equality not just in lip service, in terms of lip service, but equality in terms of a substantive understanding of equality, where it's not that women are trying to become as powerful as men, but actually we are differently empowering both boys and girls, or as people, as children, to think about themselves and their social context in much more broader, open-ended terms. I also think this requires a huge change in how parenting is done. You know, a much broader, wider thinking around bringing up a child, caring for a child, rather than sort of pinning hopes and aspirations of my son is going to become a doctor or is going to look after me, or the daughter is going to become this pretty model for a particular idea. That, I think, also needs to change, the way parenting is structured. You know, people who want to have children or want to raise children need not do so in these narrow terms. People need not even have children of their own. The classic feminist idea has been that childcare will be something that the state manages rather than the responsibility of women, right? Even within development thinking, that idea is being pushed aside quite greatly. But in a preferable future, that very core feminist idea that a child or a body that is born is not the responsibility of the biological source that it's coming from, that it's managed in a wider sense, is I think fundamental. You know, and this is a feminist challenge. This is a queer feminist challenge to somehow achieve. A bold challenge, perhaps, I would add, but a very complicated one. I see also the comment in the chat about blue or pink as being somehow a very recent thing. Absolutely. And these are very, as I said, in pre-colonial context, this is not how gender has been done. This is not how gender has ever been thought about. There have been hierarchies always in society, but they have been according to seniority or age or spiritual status or various other forms of thinking about it. So for me, it's not just gender, it's also capitalism. It's also the idea of nations and borders that need to be challenged in a preferable future. We can't just talk about gender equality. It has to be equality across the board in this, I think, very radical, very powerful, and very challenging way of breaking free from these capitalist structures. A task that is perhaps quite implausible to think about right now, but requires, I think, some courage and some imagination to visualize and perhaps bring to life. Again, I'll leave it there.
And thank you so much for giving us those images there of what for you would be a desirable future. Leslee, I'm curious for your thoughts on this question. What does a world of possibility which is hopeful for you look like?
Look, I must say again that I'm actually experiencing it. This isn't something it's something I dreamed about, but I'm doing it. It's happening. You can go to any number of classrooms. There are many, many, many thousands of them now across 20 countries. Full saturation in certain cities, states. Monterrey, the second biggest city in Mexico, is at full saturation. Every 3, 4, and 5-year-old doing 3 different levels of a program that teaches them from day one that every single human being on this planet is unique. No two are the same. There is no difference between our values, though there are many, many differences between us which are to be celebrated, because that uniqueness is an incredibly positive thing. These are children who are learning from day one at the age of 3 that all emotions are okay. Anger is okay. Nothing wrong with anger. It's a natural feeling to feel. What matters is if it is an unpleasant feeling like anger or extreme sadness or extreme excitement, if it is an unpleasant and very high energy feeling, there are ways of making it a more pleasant feeling, making it a less high energy feeling so that you have a sense of equilibrium, so that you can be happy and relaxed. But there's nothing wrong with, so there are all of these extraordinary pedagogies and philosophies that have their roots in the most enlightened thinkers of our time. So Ken Robinson, the founding patron of Think Equal, who has sat and pored over our lesson plans and our resources with me, who has written one of our books called Loving Earth. The 2 co-founders of Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, best practice of their ruler program and mood meter, Dr. Urvashi Sani from Lucknow, who is a specialist in empowering girls through education and gender constructs. That is her area of specialty. Vicky Colbert from Colombia, Sheila Wamahiu from Kenya. I mean, a fantastic group of 22 global thought leaders have come together to create this. And it's happening. So, for me, the fundamental thing is not to sit here and talk, not to sit here and imagine desirable futures. Desirable futures will only come about if we create them. And futures can only be created. I agree with so much of what you've said, Shannon, so much of what you've said. And the only point I would disagree with is to separate out systems from people. You can't separate, because people have created these systems. You can't look at the law as a system and say, if the law is high functioning, if it has the right quantum of punishment and of motivation, which law never has, but if the law somehow were perfect, then we would find with the perfect system improvements in the social development index. You're not going to find that. Why? Because culture trumps law. Culture is human programming. That's what culture is. We may not have had pink and blue pre-colonial times, but we sure as hell had sweets being handed out when a boy was born and celebrated. and commiserations handing out when a girl was born and not celebrated. Next time, God willing, it'll be a boy. We've had that for centuries. You know, religions are absolutely man-made to prop up an organization of society that is an expression of patriarchy. That's what religion is. In the Jewish religion, which is the religion I was brought up in and rejected at the age of 12, and rejected because of what I'm about to tell you, in a particular prayer, the morning prayer, the Shacharit, it says in this holy text, which is supposedly passed down by God, excuse me, what kind of an idiot do you think I am? In this text, it says, I thank God that he did not make me a woman. And in Hindu temples, a woman can't go into a temple if she's menstruating or go into the kitchen. The very woman who has created you, you know, and we can't put it all down to systems and colonialism. And at the end of the day, it's new leaders we need with new mindsets. And until and unless we change the mindset, we can sit here talking till the cows come home. Nothing will change. And to change mindset, you can only do that through education of a particular kind. And that is why the Think Equal program is that kind of education that plugs in the missing dimension to education. Education is a system which was designed, created in and for the Industrial Revolution, its purpose to fill factories, full stop. You have the most highly so-called educated men raping and beating their wives and disposing of their daughters because they want sons and what have you, trafficking girls, the most highly educated. You only need to see my film India's Daughter and listen to those lawyers who make the rapists look and sound like angels, frankly, right? So what kind of education is it that changes mindset, that will lead to this desirable world that we would like to imagine? It's social emotional learning for social justice. That's what I call it. Some people call it 21st century skills. They make me howl with laughter because frankly, did we never need it in any other century, you know? Some people call it soft skills. Well, don't patronize me. The skill, the neural pathway created and the synaptic connections created in the course of an empathetic response are as powerful and hard as those created when doing a mathematical calculation. So there's nothing soft about these skills and competencies that I'm talking about, right? They're just another set of skills and competencies without which nothing's going to change. So I think, I mean, again, I come back to, I have to be hopeful because I see it happening in front of my eyes. I'd be insane, you know, if I didn't call what's happening intensively hopeful and optimistic. And it is the path, and I think the only path. And I will focus every breath until my dying breath on bringing this program to scale to every child in every classroom and every home now, because we've got many iterations of the program now. We've got animations and a TV series we're about to give for free to a number of countries to get out there for those who are not connected, which is kind of 80% of us, right? Put it all online, we're told, you know. Well, we've got several iterations of this program now to ensure that we can get into the rural communities. We're with, you know, tribal communities in Jharkhand, in indigenous people of Guerrero, etc. And it's working. What can I say? I'm hugely optimistic.
Thank you, Leslie. As those of you who are watching may have noticed, with all our images of the future, there are assumptions that undergird them. Doesn't mean those assumptions are neither good or bad. It just means we have them. That can be about what we think it means to be human. It could be about a particular type of system that we think is going to exist and why, what values people hold. There, behind every image we have, there is some sense of this has to happen for this to happen, right? There's a there's an assumption essentially undergirding each of these images, and we can dive deep into that, you know, in a full futures literacy lab, and we can talk more about this at some other time. But what I'm going to do now in the next phase of our discussion is to almost give you a sense of what it looks like to unpack an assumption and flip it around a little bit in what we call a reframe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to engage with one particular parameter. I mean, there are multiple ideas that have been shared today, and we would need a long time to be able to explore all of them in much more detail. But I'm just going to flip one or two ideas around to give you a sense of what it looks like to explore an alternative scenario, which is neither probable nor preferable, but quite confusing. And the objective of this is to think about things a little bit beyond our comfort zone, and to come up with new ideas which we may not have come up with otherwise. And we'll see where this goes. So I'm going to pose 2 points. So Shannon, I'm interested, Shannon, in giving you a parameter around the state and leadership, because we've mentioned quite a bit, and Leslie also, the sense of, you know, the broader systems and their power in all of this. And I'm interested, if I said to you that in an alternative future, there is no such thing as leadership, and there's no such thing as a state either, but instead the way humans organize themselves is as if they were a murmuration, like birds, right? This is the way humans organize themselves. You know, they kind of, there's a sense of fluidity, they fly around, but there's no particular leader, there's no particular direction. This is just how they operate. They have a way of making sense of things without having to label things. This is what we can just call it a murmuration type society. I'm interested for you to have a little think about that, and to offer me some sense of what that might look like, but also like what value it could hold with relation to some of the things that we've spoken about today, in terms of the ability of people to be themselves, to express their personalities, or whether there are these other identities in that world and how they might, what form they might take. And also particularly what safety could look like. We've mentioned a lot today about violence and different types of violence. It's physical, mental. I'm curious to see what does safety look like in a world which might be structured like that. Of course, there are no correct answers when we flip things around like this, and the whole point is to put us on the spot a little bit, just to think about outside the box. That's for Shannon, and I'll come back to Shannon in just a moment and give Shannon a bit of time to have a think about that one. For Leslie, the parameter I'm interested in is to flip around education a little bit. Leslie, you mentioned a lot today about how socio-emotional learning is a really important part to us getting to the future that we want. But what if in the future there was no such thing as formal education? We didn't have schools, but we had other ways of learning. Learning was experienced outside of a classroom. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts on what that could look like, and whether or not a scenario like that would get us to where we need to be headed, in your view. If we had not formalized educational systems, but much more informal ways of learning, one experienced learning in quite different ways, not in such a formalized capacity, but just by virtue of experiencing life in different ways, what that could look like. So perhaps no curriculum, but just human experience in other ways. I'm curious to see you, just posing that question to you, what you think about it, and whether or not it's a possibility for the kinds of changes that you would like to see. Before we come to that, I'll flip over to Shannon, who's had a little bit longer to think about the parameter I threw in his direction. Shannon, your thoughts then on this idea of a murmuration?
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, and something I've never thought about, a murmuring society that's perhaps without a leader or without the central core that's dictating how to live or how to do things. One parallel is a lot of people have talked about social media, digital platforms, Twitter, YouTube as democratic platforms or democratic spaces. But we know that they are not at all democratic, that they are highly charged with inequalities, right? And that's what I was thinking with murmuration. I mean, does that mean that it is a slightly more democratic society where everybody's opinions matter? But actually, if there are inequalities, those will be reflected in what gets murmured to what extent and what directions. And so, for me, again, the fundamental question becomes about inequality of different forms. How do we address gender inequality, economic inequality, racial, global inequalities in a powerful way to create slightly more equitable ways of murmuring, of speaking, of different perspectives being valued together? So I think for me, it's not just about leadership or the state and how that changes, but actually maybe it's about inequality of various forms that we need to be thinking about, inequalities that are embedded in where we live, how we live, in the township versus the slum versus the city and the suburb, inequality in education, who goes to which university, which schools, what kind of resources, how these are allocated. The question around safety is also really important. For me, fundamentally, violence towards queer bodies, towards women, towards some men, are always questions of power. Who has power over whom? Who dominates whom? Violence is fundamentally about power inequalities to me. And so again, the thought about inequality comes into this murmuring society. You know, if there are still continued deeper gender inequalities, deeper sexual inequalities, queer bodies, women's bodies will still not be particularly safe because those inequalities will be perpetuated. And so for me, it is about really the fundamentals of building an equitable society. And just going back to Leslie's points, I think education in the way she's tangibly talking about is really one of the starting points where I would also want to begin. If I was doing something like trying to build an equitable world where this inequalities in a murmuring society are reduced, maybe education is the way to start. You know, precisely as Leslie says, education is being very narrowly conceived in our schools across the world and across society. There is almost no learning about emotional intelligence, or even sexual education is very narrow, I would argue, in how it's taught. So perhaps education and learning, not just for children, but maybe at a broader scale. You know, maybe Leslie's program will expand for all generations across the world, because I think that is precisely what it is. Raising awareness, critical thinking, developing empathy is precisely the kinds of things, an emotional being that we need to be generating. And again, as Leslie's suggesting, structures are not absolute or watertight. You know, capitalism is not this free-floating structure that's moving around. If the people who occupy capitalist positions and relationship with capitalism are different people, then capitalism as a structure changes. Or if governments are occupied by people who think differently, do differently, governments themselves also change. So within at least feminist policy thinking, structures are changeable, they are changing, and people can change those structures. So I would come back to this idea that perhaps education might be one of the ways in which this murmuring society could be a better, slightly more equitable place to be in. But my fundamental question would be then, why would somebody want equality? Why would a child want equality? You know, we also have to think about capital and these other structures beyond the person. You know? None of my boys today, the men I've been interviewing, would want to give up patriarchal power. You know, women would want them to give up patriarchal power, but they get so much privilege, so much dividend, so much prestige from it. They want to hold on to it. They want it to continue. So that then becomes another challenge that we have to deal with. Why is equity or desiring an equitable society beneficial for us all? Why should we convince the men of Wall Street, the white middle class, cisgender, heterosexual men, to give up some of their white privilege, their sexual privilege, their masculine privilege, and become lesser? You know, that I think is what a murmuring society needs to get at. How we can get people to be more equitable, to build that equity. I'll leave it there again.
I agree with everything you just said, Shannon. Sorry, I'm jumping in immediately. I hope you meant me to talk if you didn't stop me now. Look, Shannon, we will never get those men of Wall Street to give that all up. That is why I will not spend a minute of my time on anyone above the age of 6. Because it's only up to the age of 6 that we can put those foundations in. Now, once this education, and it matters not what the form is, it matters only what the contents are. If you're murmuring the right thing in a murmuration, then it's fine. Now, children are born empathetic, but if those pathways of empathy are not strengthened and repeated and rehearsed and experientially built prior to the age of 6, there are these extraordinary graphs by the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, Professor Jack Shonkoff's work, and Al Race, and preeminent, amazing neuroscientists, all of whose work has informed the program that I lead, the Think Equal program, that show, and we know, we've mapped out the human brain, we know so much, right? We know that after the age of 6, we're pretty much hardwired. It's not to say we cannot change at all, but it is to say that enormous effort is required to change that hardwiring, to unlearn what we've learned and relearn it. And if we've learned by the age of 6 to man up, not to cry like a girl, not to celebrate when a girl is born, whatever it is, right? To stay away from that dark-skinned person over there because, you know, better you don't play with them, whatever it is. If we've learned that by the age of 6, that is what's going to stick. So all of the children who are now learning prior to the age of 6, and we're teaching kids at 3, level 1, at 4, level 2, and at 5, level 3. And if the kids only do one level of those 3, they will still be transformed for the rest of their lives. Guaranteed, there are 60 plus years of evaluations and RCTs, and 3 of those RCTs have been done on 3 countries for us that we've worked in: Australia, Botswana, and Colombia, and the results are statistically significant: reduction of anger and aggression, increase of emotion regulation, increase of pro-social behavior, increase of empathy, etc. Now, once you change that mindset at saturation in an entire region or city or country, you just watch what will happen to the social costs. You just watch what will happen to the statistics of suicide and bullying and rape and antisocial behaviors and attitudes. So if you have a truly learned, educated society, because that is what we have decided we're teaching our children, they will grow up, whether they're leaders or not, whether we're a murmuration society or a society that is much more structured in some new way or old way, it matters not. It's about what the contents is, not the form. So in the same way, do we need a formal classroom? Of course we don't. But we need to learn the 25 competencies and skills that Think Equal teaches our children.
Mm-hmm. And Leslee, if I could just encourage you to just to go deep on that thought that you just mentioned there, about ultimately it's about the skills. Where they are experienced doesn't matter, whether that be a formal or informal setting. Would you be able to just say, if I said to you that they couldn't happen in the formal setting, that there was no such thing as a formal setting in a particularly alternative, crazy scenario, how might one experience these skills then? How might one, how could you acquire them if you weren't taught them?
Well, to begin with, the problem is, that is why the Think Equal program is prescriptive. It's made up of 90 lesson plans per level. That's 270 lesson plans in total that we've created, bullet point by bullet point, telling the practitioner, the parent, the teacher, the 16-year-old in a refugee setting who's teaching the little 3 or 4 or 5-year-old exactly what questions to ask, exactly what to draw out. It's got 24 narrative picture books. It's got a 6-week program within it, which teaches mindfulness and focusing on the inside and the outside and regulating your feelings, which has been co-written with it by the Dalai Lama. Extraordinary best practice programs, tools that I've managed to gather in the world in the last 6 years, right? But it needs to be taught only because it's been missing from our world. So teachers now, parents now, all they can do right now without a program that teaches this new subject, this missing subject to them, these missing 25 competencies and skills. Without that, all they can do is generationally and cyclically pass down their discriminations, their prejudices, and their antisocial attitudes and behaviors, right? And children will learn from role models. They will look at, that is biological, that is inbuilt, ingrained. You can't change the parents. You can't. However much we'd like to say you can, and however frustrating it is to hear that. And, you know, one of our questions here from Sandeep is, what about young masculinity or young males in villages? It's males anywhere right now, males and females who did not learn this learning, who did not get the benefit, the privilege of the Think Equal program and what it teaches. We can't do anything about them as much as we'd like to. They are entrenched in their attitudes. We have to focus on the young ones, the next generation, to be the agents of social change. Simple as that. Once they become the parents, believe me, their kids will be okay with or without the program being formally written down and prescriptive like that. But right now it needs to be prescriptive. I mean, we've just had a pandemic. Did we say to our scientists and doctors and nurses, by the way, make a vaccination, it's okay, you can put whatever you like in it. Just use whatever ingredients come into your mind. This is science. We have to put this much for this many doses and these many hours and for this many weeks and how many times a week. And it's very, very serious stuff. So you can't just hope it'll happen. You have to teach it well to begin with. And if you start off by saying we're going to train all our teachers to be enlightened, you're living in a fool's paradise. And it's going to take several generations to get nowhere.
No, Leslie, thank you for those points. And as we transition to the final bit here of the webinar, I invite everybody who's been tuning in so far to pose your questions and comments as well in the chat and also in the Q&A function. Either works. But as you may have seen here, we've got a few new questions that are already emerging by virtue of talking about the future in these ways. So Shannon was talking about, you know, once the reframe was posited, this idea of equality and what value equality actually holds came out that bit more in our conversation. And with Leslie, it was a sense of, well, it doesn't matter actually whether it's formalized or informalized. At the moment, it's entirely necessary that it is prescriptive, but ultimately it's an experience that needs to be had. So is there a new question perhaps for us to think about with regards to, well, if we can't have these experiences formalized all the time, how else can we experience them? So I'm posing these questions both to everybody who's watching and both to our participants. What I'm curious to hear are new questions, not necessarily answers at the moment, we'll get to that, but new questions that have emerged for you by virtue of doing these exercises or virtue of thinking about the future and talking about masculinity over the past hour or so. What new questions come up? I just highlighted one or two there, but I'm curious if there are any others. Do pop them in the chat. Shannon, is there something else that's come up for you, a new question for us to think about?
Absolutely. I mean, one question that, as Leslie was talking, I was thinking about was, you know, why is it that we need this kind of learning now? You know, is there something about the moment in the world and the present state of masculinities that is significant in lacking around these values? You know, why couldn't, I mean, could there have been previous generations where grandparents have taught similar values, or schools or rabbis or imams have taught similar forms of reflection about equality and thinking? And is there something, again, about the particular moment, about capitalism, about the way in which this really hyper-competitive world in which we live, the really unequal world that we inhabit today, that levels of violence towards women are increasing, that these questions are, that it becomes so important to teach this, you know? That's what one thought I was having right now. What is the significance of the present and this learning that is required now, and how that might change in the future, as it perhaps has done in the past? I also really like the idea of form, that actually you don't need a classroom. These are broad sets of values that need to be learned by people. as Leslie was saying, it can happen in a classroom, under a tree, under a refugee camp, on the street. But essentially, it's a set of skills that people need to learn. It needs to be prescriptive right now as a strategy for implementation. But maybe in the future, it's not going to be prescriptive. Maybe Netflix documentaries are going to trigger people to think about some of these questions in directive ways, and that might also bring social change. So yeah, that was the question about what is it about the now that this education is so required.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We've got a few questions coming in. Some here around the importance of a socio-educational policy in after the toxic moment, or if a society has particularly violent history, and why that's necessary. But Leslie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on a new question, perhaps for us to think about. How maybe perhaps around experience. How else could we experience this, and what question do we need to ask ourselves if we need to experience this not only in the classroom?
I'm sorry to say, I don't believe we can. How are we? I mean, an individual can experience it by asking for it, opening themselves up to it and saying, this is the pilgrimage I want to go on right now. To some degree, I as an individual am a living embodiment of that. For 50 plus years of my life, I lived a life that was focused on getting fame. Yes, I wanted that. Wealth. Oh, yes, I wanted that. And I found all sorts of excuses for why it was necessary. I had children. I needed to take care of them. I needed to make sure they would be okay. So most of my life, I pursued my filmmaking career, my job, my very male values, actually, accumulation of wealth, taking care of my kids' future, programmed by my Jewish culture, perhaps, to think that way. And suddenly at the age of 57, I sit and interview a bunch of rapists in Tihar jail, and my entire life stops. And nothing I've ever done has been good enough. I have totally gone on this journey in the last 6 years or so, gone on a journey in which I've decided to experience. I've immersed myself. I've chosen. That's pretty unusual. How are you going to get that to scale, right? And as a result of what I've chosen, I have so fundamentally changed my outlook on life and the purpose of my life that I absolutely refuse to be paid for the work I'm doing. That's the first thing that I will never do, is take one penny for the work I do. I work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. I've done that for 8 years, and I refuse to take a penny for the work I do. Why? Because this isn't a job to me. I don't want it to become a job. I've had my jobs. I don't want any more jobs. I don't want to accumulate wealth. I want to change things. I want purpose in my life, and I've never been happier. And I've turned my life around. I've given up my métier, the love of my life, the making of films, and I have my children, my husband, all have to be very patient with me, because it's 18 hours a day that I'm not focused on them. I'm focused on this work. But an individual can do that. But how are you going to scale a change of attitude, a complete sea change, a mindset change, which is what I underwent? So I can't, having experienced it myself, I can't sit here and say to you, oh no, it's not possible. It is on an individual level, but it's not going to make a kick of difference for a few individuals, or even hundreds, or even thousands of individuals, should such a miracle be possible, which it isn't. You need this at scale. You need the mindset of that country, of this world, to be changed, of all men and all women and all genders. You need everybody's mindset to be changed to this collective humanity, that we're all human beings. It matters not who we are. It matters what we are. We are a human community, full stop. But you have to scale it, or it's meaningless.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are a bunch of things there which perhaps, if we had more time, we could explore a bit more, which would be this idea that if, who can experience this? Perhaps at the moment it's a question of a position of privilege, of an ability to do so, and there's also a degree of emotional labor that comes perhaps with some of this work and actually thinking about these questions as well, depending on who one is. But as we kind of hit the last 10 minutes of our discussion, I'm interested in the next steps now that we can take in light of doing these futures activities today and thinking about what we think is likely, what we think is probable. What if one or two things were switched around? What new questions do we have? What now do we want to do? And there's one important question here, and please do keep them coming, from Dexter, which says, how do progressive movements prepare for the backlash that may or will come against advocacy for a post-gender world and those who react violently to the threat to their gender-based identity? So perhaps that's an initial next step for us to think about. How do we respond to that backlash, which is already there and which might continue to come if we speak in the way in which we are speaking? Shannon, any thoughts from your side? What is the next step we might take, both in light of that question and from other things that you've been thinking about in the past hour or so?
Yes, I think the backlash is very real and it is a constant. That's precisely the point. Why would people want equality? Why would men want to give up power if they only benefit from it? So that's what we are seeing, I think, the backlash in terms of the rise of right-wing nationalisms across the world, the rise in greed and capitalist culture and the desire to accumulate more and more. And that's what people are largely taught to do. So the backlash is going to be happening at multiple fronts. So in that sense, Leslie's ideas are also being challenged by other forces. Religious fundamentalism is on the rise in various parts of the world, right? So Southern Africa, Asia is becoming more and more right-wing, more and more fundamentalist, right? Why then, that arguably is precisely a backlash to feeling threatened by this world with its new fluffy, woolly values of equality, of evenness and things. Religion is becoming more and more toxic. But nationalism is becoming more and more toxic. And so we do have to, I think beyond just gender, but also situate gender within this wider system of operations in the world in how we are addressing this. That to me is a challenge about how we think about the backlash, and that's not going to go away. In fact, this is something that feminists keep talking about. Gay rights has made much more progress than women's rights around the world, and that's because gay rights do not require a redistribution of power in the way women's rights have required it. Women's rights are much more difficult to achieve because it requires men to give up power for women to have power. Queer rights, gay rights can be assimilated slightly more easily. That's why we are seeing a proliferation of slightly more equal queer rights, gay rights around the world in different contexts. So I think the backlash to gender equality is extremely powerful. And that question is a really important one that we have to keep grappling with. I don't really have answers, but I think it's in the inequalities, the broader inequalities of society, that gender has to be situated. The economic inequalities, the greed, the obsessions that capitalism produces, that I think gender has to be situated in. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And keep your questions and comments coming, folks. We've got another 5 minutes or so. Leslie, for you, the next step, perhaps it's an educational one, and we emphasize that. But are there any other things that you can point us in the direction of?
Absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I cannot stress this enough. There is nothing other than mindset change that's going to make one jot of difference. If you think that there is, you're fooling yourself, quite simply. And the only way to deal with backlash, who cares? Is a backlash worse than people being bombed in Ukraine, or the kind of atrocities that are going on right now in Yemen that we've all forgotten about, or Syria that we've all forgotten about? Is a backlash worse than that? Who cares about a backlash? Just get on with it. Do the right thing. Start being counted. Get up off your asses and do something to educate the next generation, because you're living in a fool's paradise if you think it's going to happen by itself. It's not. And every one of you is needed. Just become fearless. I'm fearless. I couldn't give a damn about a backlash. That's all I can say. Sorry I appear so fierce, but, I'm clear. I know what I am doing. I see the results, and I'm not going to sit and discuss things that are theoretical, because I know what the concrete answer is. And I'm sorry, for me, there's only one answer. I can't pretend that there's more. Forgive me.
No, of course. I mean,
I know that, you know, in discourse, one should be open-minded and think of various theories and ways. I can't. And also, there's so little time to get on and do this, you know. I mean, we're in 20 countries, but there are 190 what of them. There's a lot to be done. And actually, please forgive me, but I have to run because I've got 2 minutes to find a cab to get on my next call in the cab on my way to the office where I have a meeting. Please forgive me for running away, but it's been fantastic. And thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to me. And Shannon, wonderful to meet you. And Kushal, I adore you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Leslie.
Let's go. Bye. Bye.
Bye. For those of you who are still able to stick around for the next couple of minutes, do keep your final questions and thoughts coming through as well. Shannon, some final reflections from your side then. I mean, Leslie's telling us that, you know, ultimately it's the solution is an educational one. It's a mindset focused one. It's necessarily a prescriptive one at the moment. When one thinks about the backlash, I mean, I don't really see Boris Johnson or Narendra Modi sitting down and saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to change my mindset now. You know, so how does one appeal to people who we can't actually educate 3 to 6 year olds and want to actually see some change with people who perhaps, you know, and I can see where Leslie comes at this from, you know, people who are beyond hope, beyond that age bracket. What do we do then? What other steps could we take?
Yeah, I mean, again, hugely important question. I mean, my thought is, I mean, is Ukraine not a backlash? I mean, you know, or is the Modi government or the Trump regime, are they not backlashes already that we have to deal with? You know, these are the realities of the world. And yeah, you're completely right. Perhaps, as Leslie's suggesting, we all have a role to play in it, in this story of change. You know, the murmuring society, Kushal, you pointed out, it's such an important thought. I mean, we could be part of a murmuring society, all of us, in our murmurs that might then reach the leadership in important ways. You know, we're seeing very regressive legislation in the US right now. We're seeing all kinds of changes happening to trans laws in the UK too. And maybe this is the point at which we need to be murmuring, and we need to be amplifying these murmurs as much as possible to get voices heard, to get more perspectives on the table. Sometimes these big changes are very difficult to imagine and think about, and academics love to make things into the abstract. And I think the benefit of being in conversation or in dialogue with people like Leslie are that there are tangible ways in which they're trying to make a difference or trying to make inroads. And I think there is value in working with those inroads, but also perhaps questioning what those inroads can achieve and how far they can go in achieving these bigger goals.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think perhaps one critique that sometimes people pose towards the kind of educational solution is like, well, how long are you going to wait for it? You know, and so, you know, ultimately, what else can you do about paranoid and mindsets which are insecure and which reflect that insecurity onto others? Any other questions and final thoughts? Do keep them coming. We have literally a minute. But I mean, so far this has been a really interesting discussion. I'm really glad that everybody's been able to participate in it. And just to wrap up, in case there's any, if there is a final question, do pop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. But to wrap up, I suppose, we hope you've enjoyed this discussion and have come away with some new ideas, new questions to think about, and that maybe you see the benefits of doing futures literacy type activities. There will be a written piece that we hope will come from this conversation to draw on some insights from it. And there is also the possibility of this talk being housed online as well, which we are exploring. So this is very much just an initial conversation. We hope there are many more of these that happen, not only just with us, but with many people worldwide. And you can hopefully stay have seen the importance of such topics and chatting about them, and not only chatting about them, as Leslie would say, but actually doing something about them afterwards. Shannon, any final thoughts from your side before we wrap up?
No, none. But I think it is a fantastic conversation to keep thinking about the futures and thinking about the futures of masculinities, and the importance of thinking about it, I think, has really come out in this conversation. So absolutely, thank you for the really fantastic engagement, both from you, Leslie, and the people in the chat who've been adding thoughts. I hugely enjoyed this.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining. We've hit 4:30, and we're going to close it there.